After the American Civil War, the Wild West became a vast territory where the law was a vague idea, often ignored or distorted. Over decades, settlers, miners, natives, and gunmen spread across these wild lands, trying to find their place in a world seemingly ruled by brute force. The lack of solid government infrastructure made violence the primary means of resolving disputes, and survival depended on one's ability to navigate this savagery. In this setting, the first cities and towns began to emerge, where the attempt to build a civilization faced resistance from the untamed nature of the land and the people who inhabited it. The emergence of the first laws in the West was a response to the desperate need for some form of order amidst the chaos. There was no organized police force or authorities capable of consistently enforcing rules. Instead, local communities began appointing sheriffs or representatives who, in many cases, were more like vigilantes than traditional figures of authority. These sheriffs were men with little formal training, but a strong will to enforce what they deemed just. However, their decisions were often subjective and shaped by the context of each town or settlement, resulting in uneven justice, often dependent on who was quickest with a gun. Over time, the lack of a firm legal structure made the Wild West a territory dominated by the law of the gun. In each town, small groups formed where personal disputes turned into violent confrontations. Those who sought justice in a formal manner were constantly challenged by those who preferred to solve their problems through force. The tension between those who believed in the order of the law and those who saw violence as the only answer to their problems became a defining feature of this era. The streets of the West became battlefields where the quickest on the draw often decided the fate of many. At the heart of the Wild West, the first knights of the law emerged, men like sheriffs or marshals who became the last line of defense against chaos and anarchy. These men, often lacking formal training, took it upon themselves to establish some form of order. However, the nature of the West, with its vast distances and lack of resources, made these lawmen not much different from the outlaws they tried to fight. Their decisions were often as ruthless as those of the criminals they pursued, creating a fine line between the role of hero and that of survivor. Over time, the lawmen began to create their own code of conduct, a morality shaped by the extreme circumstances of the West. While many sought to do the right thing, the line between what was right and what was necessary for survival often blurred. Sheriffs, for example, had to make quick decisions, often without due legal process, which led to complicated situations. To protect their communities and maintain order, these men were forced to make tough moral choices, where the consequences of a mistake could be fatal, both for themselves and for those they swore to protect. As the Wild West became increasingly populated and violent, the decisions of the lawmen were questioned by many. Over time, a crucial question arose. Were these men merely survivors in a world without rules, or were they true heroes trying to maintain order in a place where justice was often determined by the fastest gun? Each town a sheriff tried to control became a microcosm of a larger struggle to define what is right, just, and morally acceptable. In the end, these lawmen had to face not only outlaws but also the ghosts of their own choices and actions. In the Wild West, gunmen emerged as complex figures challenging authority and the legal structure. For them, true freedom was not found in obedience to the law, but in the ability to live without the restrictions imposed by society. Each gunman had his own code of honor, often at odds with the laws trying to govern the West. They saw the law as an imposition, a flawed system that limited their individual freedom. For many, the only true law was that of the strongest, the right to resolve disputes with a fast and accurate shot. Gunmen became symbols of extreme freedom, where the only rule was survival. Often they were hired to settle disputes that local authorities couldn't or wouldn't handle, turning the West into a personal battleground between those seeking to impose order and those preferring to impose their own justice. For the gunman, life was a matter of honor and revenge, and decisions were made not based on the law, but on what each considered to be their truth. Towns became arenas where deadly duels were the final form of conflict resolution. The pursuit of freedom and personal justice by gunmen often brought them into direct conflict with the figures of authority in the West. Sheriffs and marshals were seen as representatives of a broken system, while gunmen viewed themselves as defenders of a more natural order, where force was the only valid currency. This constant clash between the authority of the law and the freedom of the gunman spiraled into violence, where every act of rebellion brought more vengeance, more death, and more destruction. In the end, many gunmen became legends, known not only for their skill with a gun, but for the way they challenged the very idea of law and order. As the Wild West expanded and more people arrived to settle the land, the pressure for a more formal order became inevitable. The federal government began sending more resources and agents to restore order, and with that, the first attempts to establish a consistent legal framework began to emerge. The arrival of railroads, the establishment of courts, and the creation of a more organized police force began to transform what was once a realm of anarchy into a more structured society. However, resistance was strong. Many still saw the imposition of law as a threat to the hard-won freedom. The transition from a Wild West to a more controlled and regulated society did not happen without conflict. The figures of authority, now more structured and with greater support from the government, began to clash with the remnants of gunmen and lawmen who still fought for a more flexible system. For many, the arrival of order meant the end of an era where personal freedom was at risk. However, as formal law took hold, a new form of justice began to emerge, one more impersonal and bureaucratic, which, while having the power to protect citizens, also undermined the spirit of self-reliance that defined the West. The collapse of the Wild West as a territory where law was imposed by the strength of arm and gunfire brought with it the rise of a new era. The arrival of modernity, railroads, the judicial system, and federal authorities inevitably altered the balance of power in the West, but the legacy of gunmen and lawmen did not disappear entirely. They lived on in legends and stories told around campfires, in taverns, and in the towns that were now beginning to flourish under the weight of the new order. Even with the rise of a more formal justice system, the memories of a wild and merciless West still haunted those who had lived and fought in that lawless world. The transition from the Wild West to the modern West was marked by a constant tension between the values of individual freedom and the need for an organized legal structure. The evolution of law and order meant the end of many practices that had been crucial to survival in the Wild West, but it also brought a sense of stability and security. The legacy of lawmen and gunmen, however, remains, reminding us of a time when the law was shaped by strength and courage, and where the concept of justice was not in the hands of a distant government, but in the bravery of every man and woman who dared to live on the edge.